December 1944. In the Ardennes forest, German soldiers crouched in frozen foxholes, their breath rising in thin white clouds. The ground shook not from artillery, but from something more unsettling. An endless rumble of engines beyond the tree line, trucks, convoys, an iron river of supplies moving with unnerving precision. One Wehrmacht corporal, writing home to his family, could barely disguise his disbelief. The Americans, they do not fight like us. They fight with gasoline, with endless food, with columns that never end. Their war comes by truck. For 3 bitter winters, the Germans had fought the Soviets, the British, the Americans. They had seen tanks, infantry, artillery. But this was something new, an enemy whose power seemed to multiply each day, not weaken. By late 1944, U.S. supply lines were delivering more than 2,500 tons of food, ammunition and fuel every single day into Western Europe. To the men of the Wehrmacht, exhausted and undersupplied, it was as though their enemy had tapped into a reservoir of strength that could never be drained. The Ardennes offensive, December 16, 1944, Hitler's last gamble, was meant to shatter Allied morale. But as German units pushed west, they discovered the true immovable object, not just American tanks or guns, but the sheer machinery of American logistics. Convoys stretched across the horizon. Road networks hummed with ceaseless motion. A division cut off one day seemed fully resupplied the next. To the defenders, it felt less like fighting men and more like fighting a machine. How did this miracle take shape? How did a nation 3,000 miles across the Atlantic conjure up such precision in the middle of Europe, across shattered railroads, cratered bridges, and bitter winter roads? The answer was not luck. It was not chance. It was the culmination of planning, training, and a culture that had turned industry into a weapon. America had not entered the war with the biggest army or the most experienced generals. But it had entered with factories that never slept, engineers who thought in miles and tons, and leaders who understood that battles are not won by bullets alone. In Cologne, in the Ruhr and along the Siegfried Line, German prisoners often whispered the same words. We could not understand how they did it. When we destroyed one bridge, they built another. When we captured supplies, more appeared. The flow never stopped. To the American infantryman, it meant hot food in the cold, clean socks after a march, gasoline for the tanks, and endless artillery shells when the order came to fire. To the German soldier, it meant despair, the knowledge that while he shivered with an empty stomach and half a magazine of ammunition, his enemy advanced with full bellies, fueled engines, and firepower that never ran dry. The staggering scale is hard to comprehend. Imagine a constant thunder of trucks, 2.5-ton GMC Jimmies, carrying everything from chocolate bars to 105mm shells. Imagine depots the size of towns, with pyramids of ammunition crates stacked higher than houses. Imagine Red Bull Express convoys, racing night and day, headlights blacked out. Guided only by painted signs, their sole mission, feed the front line without pause. It was this rhythm, unyielding, relentless, that broke German morale as surely as any tank battle. Because behind every Sherman, behind every thunderous artillery barrage, stood not just soldiers, but the invisible system that sustained them. And that system, the Germans realized too late, was America's greatest weapon. But what was the heart of this miracle? What unseen machine powered this relentless flow of men and materiel across continents, oceans, and battlefronts? Rewind 5 years, 1940. America stood at a crossroads, powerful in potential, but fragile in readiness. The world was already at war, yet across the Atlantic, the United States seemed half asleep. Its army, ranked 17th in size behind Portugal, was a skeleton force scattered across aging bases. Its supply system was little more than a patchwork, held together by outdated trucks, unreliable rail cars, and warehouses that looked more like barns than depots. The numbers told the story. Germany by then commanded over 500,000 motor vehicles, a war machine fed by an intricate web of rail, roads and depots. America, by comparison, had just 80,000 vehicles, many of them relics from the 1920s, prone to breakdowns on even modest marches. In 1940, the entire U.S. Army operated on a budget of $1.8 billion, barely a fraction of what Germany had already poured into its mechanized forces. For decades, Americans had resisted the idea of global entanglement. The scars of the Great Depression still lingered, and the bitter memory of World War I had hardened the nation's resolve to avoid another overseas catastrophe. Isolationism was not just politics, it was a national mood. Citizens wanted jobs, not armies. They wanted breadlines to vanish, not new divisions to be raised. The supply officers of 1940 felt the pinch most keenly. Their depots were bare, their motor pools outdated, their planning tables filled with more gaps than numbers. When war planners sketched scenarios of a conflict in Europe, the logistics columns were the first to break down. The truth was stark. America was not ready for modern war. And yet in the shadows of this unpreparedness, a quiet group of visionaries began to stir. They were not generals of battlefield glory, but logisticians, men who thought not in terms of battles won, but in terms of miles of fuel, tons of ammunition, and hours of delivery. They studied Germany's blitzkrieg with fascination, noting not only the panzers at the front, but the fuel trucks racing behind them. They whispered about the need for standardized trucks, for interchangeable parts, for a doctrine that treated logistics as strategy, not afterthought. Factories still lay idle, their assembly lines geared toward peacetime products. But on paper, new designs began to take shape. Trucks with higher payloads, rail networks mapped for military use, training exercises in which supply columns, not just infantry, took the lead. The seeds of transformation were being planted, but the soil was hard and public will was reluctant. This was America in 1940, rich in resources, poor in readiness. A nation that had the steel, the oil, the factories, but lacked the urgency to turn them into weapons of supply. The German soldier of 1944 would one day marvel at the endless rivers of American convoys, but in 1940 that reality was unimaginable. Even within the army itself, doubts festered. Could a democracy, suspicious of standing armies, ever mobilize with the ruthlessness required for modern war? Could a country that measured its defense budget in billions, not tens of billions, ever match the efficiency of Germany's war machine? The questions loomed, unanswered, like storm clouds over the horizon. The architects of America's future logistics empire waited in frustration, their plans unfinished, their proposals underfunded. They needed more than foresight. They needed a spark, a single event so shocking, so undeniable, that it would wake the nation from its slumber and shatter the chains of isolation, and that event was about to arrive. December 7th, 1941. The morning sky over Pearl Harbor split with fire and smoke as Japanese aircraft tore into battleships at anchor. By the time the last bombs fell, more than 2,000 Americans lay dead, and the illusion of safety had vanished. The United States, once hesitant, now had no choice. The nation would fight, not in one theater, but across the globe. And to fight, it would need not just soldiers, but the greatest supply system the world had ever seen. The scale of the challenge was staggering. America was suddenly responsible for sustaining armies in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific all at once. Factories would have to churn out millions of rifles, tanks, planes, and ships. Farms would need to feed not only the U.S., but also starving allies. And above all, a river of fuel, ammunition, and equipment would need to flow across oceans and into the heart of battle. At first, the system was chaotic. A young truck driver in the Louisiana maneuvers of 1942 recalled convoys that stretched for miles, snarled in traffic jams on muddy roads. Engines overheated, tires blew out, fuel ran short. "We were green," he admitted later, "and the army was green with us. But we learned fast or we wouldn't survive. Every shortcoming became a lesson. Standardized training was introduced. Convoy discipline tightened. The Quartermaster Corps began refining a doctrine that treated supply columns with the same seriousness as combat battalions. The U.S. military had entered the war unready, but the fire of necessity forged discipline at a speed no peacetime drill could match. Nowhere was the demand more obvious than in fuel. By June 1944, in the build-up to the Normandy invasion, Allied forces consumed an astonishing 400,000 gallons of gasoline every single day, just to keep vehicles moving in the hedgerows of France. To Germans, still boasting of their efficient logistics machine, such numbers seemed wasteful, almost absurd, yet they underestimated the American genius for scale. Where Germany prided itself on precision, America drowned its enemy in volume. German officers, confident in their rail-bound logistics and shorter supply lines, dismissed the early American convoys as crude and disorganized. They had seen the Red Ball Express only in its infancy, clumsy columns that clogged narrow French roads. But what they missed was the speed of adaptation. Each week, each month, the Americans improved. Convoys were rerouted more efficiently, depots reorganized, ports expanded. What began as confusion slowly hardened into a system that could carry an army forward. No matter the distance, by 1943, the transformation was unmistakable. U.S. industry had mobilized fully, delivering vehicles, fuel cans, rations, and ammunition in quantities that defied imagination. Truck drivers, who once struggled to keep their convoys moving, were now part of an unstoppable network that spanned continents. The American way of war was emerging, not elegant, not perfect, but relentless. Pearl Harbor had been the jolt, the spark that turned necessity into action. From that day forward, America's war was not just fought with rifles and tanks, but with supply trucks, merchant ships, and fuel pipelines. Logistics became the hidden battlefield, invisible to most soldiers at the front, but decisive all the same. Still, doubts remained. The enemy was formidable, the terrain unforgiving, the oceans vast, even as the United States poured men and material into Europe and the Pacific. One question lingered like a shadow over every convoy and every depot. Could this untested system truly keep the Allied war machine moving when the pressure of global combat reached its peak? August 25th, 1944. Paris had been liberated, the city erupting in joy as Allied tanks rolled beneath its boulevards. But behind the celebrations, Allied commanders faced a cold, hard truth. The front line was racing east toward Germany, and the supply depots were still back at the beaches of Normandy. The armies were advancing faster than the supply lines could follow. If the trucks failed, the entire Allied offensive would grind to a halt. The answer came in the form of a desperate experiment, one that would become legend: the Red Ball Express. Launched in late August 1944, it was a supply lifeline like nothing the world had seen before, a convoy system of 6,000 trucks, operating around the clock to feed the advance. The name came from the red ball symbol painted on signs along the convoy routes, marking the path for drivers. The rules were simple, brutal, and effective. The convoys ran one-way loops. Eastbound lanes carried supplies non-stop toward the front. Westbound lanes were reserved for empty trucks returning to reload. No detours, no delays. The routes were guarded, and civilian traffic was banned. The roads belonged to the Red Ball. Every driver knew the stakes. The Allied armies consumed fuel and ammunition at a rate no logistics officer had ever faced before. In just 1 week, Red Ball convoys delivered over 800,000 gallons of fuel, a river of gasoline that kept Sherman tanks and half-tracks roaring across France. Without it, the armored thrust that cracked open Germany's borders would have stalled in the mud. The pace was relentless. Trucks ran day and night, headlights blacked out to avoid enemy aircraft, guided only by reflective signs. Mud, dust, and exhaustion were constant companions. Drivers, many of them young African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, worked 20-hour shifts, snatching minutes of sleep in cabs that reeked of gasoline. They called it driving until your eyes bled. German commanders, accustomed to their own carefully measured logistics, scoffed at the seeming chaos of the Red Ball Express. To them, it was wasteful, burning fuel to carry fuel, risking breakdowns on unpaved French roads. They underestimated the one thing America had mastered: scale. Where German efficiency prized precision, American efficiency thrived on sheer volume. If one truck broke down, 10 more rolled past. If a bridge collapsed, engineers built a new one overnight. The flow never stopped, and with every mile, German morale weakened. Wehrmacht soldiers, who once believed the Allies would outrun their supplies, now watched in disbelief as American columns stretched to the horizon. One German prisoner admitted later, "We thought you would exhaust yourselves." Instead, it was like fighting an ocean. Endless. The Red Ball Express was more than trucks and drivers. It was innovation under fire. It was the moment when American logistics stopped being reactive and became offensive, a weapon that could strike as surely as artillery or tanks. The convoy system turned supply into momentum, transforming static depots into arteries of war, but it came at a cost. The wear and tear on vehicles was immense. Engines overheated, transmissions failed, tires shredded. Drivers pushed themselves to the breaking point. Casualties mounted from accidents, ambushes, and sheer fatigue. The system was powerful, but it was fragile. The Red Ball Express had been born out of necessity, and for a time it worked like a miracle. But as the front pushed deeper into Germany, the distances grew longer, the roads more dangerous, the strain unbearable. The question lingered with every convoy rumbling east. Could this high-speed lifeline survive the chaos of war? Beneath the roar of engines and the grinding of gears, the Red Ball Express had a heartbeat, and it was human. It was not just trucks and gasoline that pushed the Allied armies eastward, but the determination of the men and women behind the wheel, under the hood, and along the roads. Nearly 70% of Red Ball drivers were African-American soldiers, young men who wore the uniform of a country that often denied them equality at home. They were handed second-hand equipment, ordered into segregated barracks, and told they would not see combat. But in France, they proved indispensable. Without them, the supply lines would have collapsed. Private James Baldwin, a driver in the fall of 1944, later recalled, "We didn't have the glory of the front line, but we had the danger. The Luftwaffe strafed us, the roads swallowed us, and the nights never ended. You drove with one eye on the fuel gauge and the other on the sky. Convoys became moving targets. German fighter bombers dove from the clouds, their cannons raking columns of trucks. Drivers swerved violently, some ditching their loads to avoid fire. Afterward, they would climb back in, patch bullet holes with rags, and keep rolling. The danger was not only from the enemy. The very pace of the Red Ball was punishing. Trucks were pushed to the limit, their engines screaming under non-stop use. Tires shredded on sharp stones, radiators boiled over in the August heat, and clutches burned out from constant shifting. A breakdown on the narrow one-way routes could snarl an entire convoy. Drivers learned to fix their trucks on the fly, crawling under chassis in mud and rain, hands numb with cold, before scrambling back into the cab to catch up. Sleep was a luxury. Soldiers drove for 20 hours straight, often surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and the rhythm of the engine. Some tied belts to the steering wheel and looped them around their wrists, so the tug would wake them if they nodded off. They joked grimly that the only thing worse than driving the Red Ball was not driving it, because not driving meant your truck had broken down and you'd fallen behind. It wasn't only soldiers. Women served as clerks, mechanics, and dispatchers, keeping the convoys moving. Civilians in liberated France worked side by side with American troops, repairing roads, unloading depots, and clearing wreckage after air raids. For them, the Red Ball was more than supply. It was survival, a lifeline that brought food, medicine, and hope. Each man and woman became a link in a chain that stretched from Normandy's beaches to the German frontier. The work was grinding, the recognition scarce, but the drivers knew what was at stake. As one Red Ball veteran put it, "You don't fight without bullets." You don't move without gas. We were the ones who brought both. Behind every tank that fired, every artillery piece that thundered, every soldier that ate a hot meal on a cold night, stood a driver who had braved exhaustion, breakdown, and enemy fire to make sure the front never ran dry. The Red Ball was not just logistics, it was sweat, grit, and sacrifice made flesh. But war is merciless, and no system, no matter how resilient, could escape its ultimate test. By late 1944, as the Allies pushed into Belgium and the Ardennes, the strain on the Red Ball grew heavier, the roads more treacherous, and the German resistance more desperate. The question loomed as supplies surged forward. One campaign would test this system to its very limits. What was it? December 16, 1944. Before dawn, the Ardennes forest erupted with fire. German artillery thundered across the snowy hills as panzer divisions surged through the fog, smashing into the thinly held American lines. It was Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. A surprise offensive meant to split the Allies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. For a moment it worked. American units were caught off guard, forced into desperate retreats. Convoys fled west under shellfire. Bridges were blown to slow the advance. German tanks pushed deep into Belgium, their crews confident that the enemy would falter. But within days, the offensive began to choke, not on bullets or courage, but on fuel. The Wehrmacht's panzers, sleek and deadly, guzzled gasoline they did not have. Tank commanders abandoned vehicles in the snow, their fuel tanks bone dry. A German officer later wrote with frustration, "Our men fought bravely. Our machines were strong, but without fuel, we were statues in the forest." The Americans faced the same danger. The sudden advance had cut units off from supply depots, leaving isolated divisions hungry and low on ammunition. Yet where the Germans stalled, the Americans adapted. The Red Ball Express, battered but unbroken, roared back to life. Drivers braved snow-choked roads, black ice, and Luftwaffe strafing runs to bring life-saving cargo forward. By the peak of the battle, American logistics delivered more than 500,000 gallons of fuel every single day to frontline units, enough to keep tanks moving, artillery firing and resistance stiffening. Convoys plowed through blizzards, headlights darkened, guided by nothing but compass bearings and instinct. At crossroads under fire, MPs waved trucks through like lifelines, each gallon of fuel worth more than gold. The effect was electric. As fuel drums and ammunition crates poured in, American morale hardened. Cut-off units that had been preparing to surrender suddenly found themselves rearmed and resupplied. Tanks that would have sat frozen in the snow now growled back to life, counter-attacking with renewed strength. German soldiers, expecting to watch the Americans wither, instead found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. One Red Ball driver, recalling those weeks, described the fear and exhaustion etched into his memory. You didn't think about sleep. You didn't think about food. You just thought about the men waiting out there. If you stopped, if you failed, they died. So you drove. Through ice, through fire, through the dark, you drove. For the Germans, the contrast was devastating. Their offensive, designed to split the Allies, was strangled by its own logistical starvation. Columns of abandoned panzers littered the Ardennes, silent monuments to the fuel that never came. For the Americans, every resupplied unit, every refueled tank became a symbol of endurance. Logistics, not just firepower, turned the tide. By January 1945, the bulge in the Allied line had been flattened, the German gamble shattered. The Wehrmacht had spent its last strength, while the Americans, battered but supplied, pushed forward with renewed force. But victory was not free. Every drum of fuel delivered to the front came at a price, of human fatigue, of broken machines, of lives risked and lost along icy roads. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel and never woke. Trucks skidded into ravines swallowed by the forest. For every success, there was sacrifice hidden in the snow. The triumph of American logistics at the Bulge was undeniable, but it demanded something heavy, Something beyond numbers and tonnage, the question remained, what had this triumph truly cost? February 1945. The war had entered its final grueling months. Allied forces pressed relentlessly into Germany, their advance fueled not just by steel and firepower, but by the invisible engine of logistics that had matured over the past year. Behind every Sherman rolling across the Rhine, behind every infantry squad advancing through shattered towns, flowed the lifeblood of victory, fuel, ammunition, food, and relentless determination. By the end of 1944, American supply lines had delivered over 1.5 million tons of supplies across Europe. Every crate, every drum, every tire was a cog in a machine that did not sleep. The Red Ball Express had evolved from a desperate experiment into a well-oiled network of roads, depots, and schedules stretching hundreds of miles behind the front. Its drivers, soldiers and civilians alike, were no longer improvising. They were executing a symphony of motion, each delivery a note in the orchestration of war. The contrast with German forces could not have been starker. Once proud panzer divisions now faltered, abandoned tanks littering roadsides like broken toys. Reports from German officers speak of units immobilized not by fire, but by fuel shortages. Up to 80% of their armor was abandoned during retreats, engines cold, and crews demoralized. The Wehrmacht had underestimated the American capacity for endurance, scale, and improvisation. American drivers, meanwhile, felt a quiet pride. Corporal Thomas Rivers recalled one stretch near the Ruhr in April 1945. The snow was deep, the bridges were gone, but we kept rolling. Every crate we delivered, every gallon of fuel, meant a Sherman stayed alive, an infantryman could move, a town was held. We were the invisible army, but we knew our work mattered. The Red Ball Express was no longer merely a convoy system. It was a psychological weapon. German commanders, expecting to cripple the Allies by cutting supply lines, watched helplessly as the network adapted faster than their blitzkrieg had ever moved. Roads bombed by airstrikes were repaired overnight. Convoys rerouted with precision. Depots stocked in anticipation of shortages. America's logistical machine did not hesitate. It did not falter, and it did not surrender. The Rhine crossing, February 1945, became a testament to this power. Engineers laid pontoon bridges under fire, while trucks delivered tons of supplies to the far bank, keeping the advancing divisions fueled, armed, and relentless. Each mile of road conquered, each depot emptied and refilled. Reinforced a simple truth. Modern warfare was decided not only by bullets, but by the flow of men and materials behind the lines. German troops wrote home with disbelief. One officer noted, "We cannot comprehend them. Where we stop, they continue. Where we retreat, they advance. It is as though they have rivers instead of roads, factories instead of barracks, and a patience that never ends." For the Americans, the story was one of resilience and ingenuity. Mechanics worked around the clock to keep trucks moving. Drivers pushed past exhaustion. Quartermasters coordinated movements across countries and theaters. Together, they formed the backbone of an army that could strike anywhere, sustained by its own foresight and relentless energy. Yet even triumph carried a hidden weight. Every mile driven, every engine repaired under fire, every night spent in a cold cab demanded a toll few ever saw. The supply machine powered victory, but its pulse was human, and its lifeblood was sweat, sacrifice, and lives spent on frozen roads far from the glory of the front. And so the question lingered over every convoy, every depot and every mile conquered, yet every mile driven carried a hidden toll. What was it? The Red Ball Express was a marvel of logistics, a machine of steel, fuel, and determination. Yet behind every mile of asphalt, every roaring engine, there lay a grim truth. Victory demanded sacrifice. Drivers knew the danger well. The pace was relentless, the schedule unyielding. Trucks ran 24 hours a day, often in blacked-out conditions to avoid enemy aircraft. Bridges were makeshift. Roads were mud-choked or bombed out, and every turn could hide a fatal pothole or an ambush. The toll was severe. On average, 200 trucks were lost each week to accidents, mechanical failure, or enemy fire. Lives were lost along with vehicles, names that would never appear in the official counts of battle. Private Marcus Thompson, a Red Ball driver from Louisiana, remembered the loss of his friend, Corporal James Willis. On a cold January night near the Ardennes, their truck skidded on black ice, plunging into a frozen ravine. Thompson survived, but Willis did not. He later recalled, "I kept driving for hours after. Every mile I put behind me, I felt him there in the cab, in the engine, in every crate of fuel I carried. That's what this war demanded of us, more than steel, more than guns. It demanded our hearts. Exhaustion was constant. Drivers napped in their seats for minutes, fueled only by coffee and adrenaline. Shifts blended into one another. Weeks and months becoming a blur of tires, screeching over gravel, headlights cutting through darkness, engines growling in the cold. Yet human endurance has its limits. The mental strain was compounded by the rigid hierarchy of the army and the racial segregation of the time. African-American drivers, who made up 70% of the Red Ball ranks, faced discrimination even as they risked life and limb to keep supply lines open. Mechanical failure was another silent enemy. The roads of France and Belgium shredded tires, boiled radiators and broke axles. Every breakdown required improvisation, often under fire. Every repair delayed the lifeline to soldiers at the front, reminding drivers that the war was as much a test of endurance as it was of ingenuity. Yet despite exhaustion, fear and prejudice, the drivers pressed on. They understood that their work was invisible but essential. Without fuel and ammunition, tanks would grind to a halt, artillery would fall silent, and the Allied advance would falter. Each convoy was a lifeline, each mile a victory against both time and human limitation. The moral weight of this relentless labor was heavy. The Red Ball Express was not just a story of innovation and efficiency, it was a story of human cost. Behind the statistics and military reports were faces etched with fatigue, eyes wide from sleepless nights, hands blackened by grease and gasoline. It was a reminder that logistics, often overlooked in the glory of battlefield tales, carried with it a burden that few outside the cab could truly understand. And yet, the world beyond the Ardennes, the Rhine, and the Ruhr began to feel the effects of this system. The ability to move mountains of supplies with precision reshaped not only the outcome of battles, but the scale and speed of global warfare. Nations watched, allies marveled, and adversaries reconsidered the meaning of industrial power and human endurance combined. The Red Ball Express had proven that logistics could dictate strategy, speed could define victory, and ordinary people could sustain extraordinary feats. But it left a lingering question, echoing far beyond the frozen roads of France. How did this logistical feat reshape the world beyond the battlefield? April 1945. The Ruhr pocket had collapsed. Germany was crumbling from within, its cities in rubble, its armies exhausted and starving for fuel. The war in Europe was drawing to a close, and amidst the celebrations of victory, a quieter triumph stood tall. The unprecedented mastery of logistics that had carried the Allied armies from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of the Reich. By the end of the war, the numbers were staggering. American supply lines had delivered more than 400 million gallons of fuel, millions of tons of food, ammunition, vehicles, and equipment, moving across oceans and continents with a precision that had bewildered friend and foe alike. The Red Ball Express, once a desperate experiment, had become a symbol of industrial and human ingenuity, a testament to the power of scale, discipline, and relentless determination. The legacy of this effort went far beyond the battlefield. America's wartime logistics laid the groundwork for modern supply chain systems, influencing industries from shipping to manufacturing. Techniques developed to move fuel and munitions at breakneck speed became blueprints for global commerce in the decades to come. The lessons of standardization, redundancy, and adaptability reshaped not just armies, but economies and nations. Yet the story was not only about numbers and strategy, it was about people. The drivers, mechanics, clerks, and engineers who had risked everything for a line of trucks became part of a living legacy. Sergeant Samuel Jenkins, reflecting on his time driving the Red Ball convoys, remembered, "We didn't fight in the newspapers. We didn't get parades, but we were the veins that kept the heart of the army beating. And I've never been prouder of anything I've done. Innovation and diversity had powered this transformation. Segregated units proved indispensable. Women kept depots running, repaired vehicles, and coordinated convoys. Civilians joined in rebuilding roads and bridges. The war had forced barriers to fall, if only temporarily, in the name of necessity and survival. The triumph of logistics was, in equal measure, a triumph of collective human effort across lines of race, gender and rank. As historians would later note, the Allies' victory owed as much to supply chains as to tanks, planes, or strategy. Where German forces faltered under shortages, American armies surged with resources, turning each logistical mile into tactical advantage. The war demonstrated that modern conflict was as much a test of industrial and organizational power as of courage or combat. Skill. The ripple effects extended beyond 1945. Military. Planners around the world studied the Red Ball Express. Civilian industries adapted convoy principles to global shipping. The integration of technology, manpower, and planning became a benchmark for efficiency. America's logistical feat was a blueprint for the modern era, a lesson in preparation, resilience, and the hidden strength of systems working flawlessly under pressure. And yet, as proud as veterans were of their role, they understood that the lessons of the Red Ball Express were not confined to history books. They were living lessons, applicable wherever resources must meet demand with precision, wherever human effort must be multiplied by innovation, and wherever the smallest delay could carry profound consequences. The question remained, echoing from the frozen roads of France to the highways and boardrooms of the modern world. Could the lessons of this efficiency still drive us forward today? The war had ended, but its lessons pulsed far beyond the shattered streets of Europe. The roads that once carried Red Ball convoys, the trucks that braved snow, ice, and enemy fire, and the drivers who risked everything, all of it became more than history. It became a blueprint, a testament to the enduring power of organization, adaptability, and human resolve. In the decades that followed, the arteries of victory stretched into the veins of global commerce. Ports, warehouses, and highways across the world adopted principles forged in the fire of war. Standardized containers, coordinated convoys, just-in-time delivery, innovations born from necessity on the European roads of 1944, now drove economies and disaster relief alike. Food reached famine-stricken regions. Medicine was delivered to earthquake zones. Aid flowed where chaos threatened. The heartbeat of logistics proved timeless. Preparation, foresight, and unity could overcome both distance and disaster. The lessons were not only technical, they were human. The Red Ball Express had thrived because people adapted under pressure, trusted one another, and took responsibility beyond the call of duty. African-American drivers who faced segregation, women working in depots, mechanics improvising repairs under fire, each acted as part of a system greater than themselves. Their courage and innovation had been invisible to most, yet decisive in every victory. Veterans recalled the rhythm of those convoys as a lesson in perseverance. Sergeant Samuel Jenkins had said, "We weren't heroes in the newspapers, but in every mile we drove, we proved that ordinary people, organized and committed, could achieve the extraordinary." That ethos, discipline, flexibility, and shared purpose resonates wherever complex challenges demand swift, coordinated action. In today's world, whether delivering relief after natural disasters or coordinating global supply chains for millions of consumers, the principles remain the same. Efficiency alone is not enough. Speed without reliability fails. Innovation without structure collapses. And above all, systems are only as strong as the people who maintain them. Adapt to obstacles and drive forward when failure seems inevitable. The Red Ball Express, long after the last convoy had rolled, offers more than history. It offers guidance. In the chaos of conflict, in the uncertainty of crisis, the fusion of human resolve and logistical mastery can bend the course of events, tipping the balance from despair to triumph, and yet its greatest lesson lies in its humanity. Every engine that roared across French highways, every truck that delivered fuel to thirsty tanks, every driver who slept in a frozen cab reminds us that no system, no machine, and no plan can succeed without people. Their courage, innovation, and unyielding commitment transformed bewilderment into a decisive advantage. They are the silent architects of victory, the unsung heartbeat behind every milestone of history. As viewers reflect on the stories of fuel, tires, and endless convoys, the message becomes universal. Collective effort, sustained discipline, and adaptability can overcome even the most daunting challenges. In every modern endeavor, whether in commerce, humanitarian relief, or community resilience, the spirit of the Red Ball Express endures, and so the rhythm of those convoys echoes still. In efficiency and unity, no enemy prevails.